Well, friends, as you heard, my talk is entitled Modernism, Housing and Me. And I put it into three parts. And also I'll be showing some pictures and photographs and things, all being well. Part one I call At the Library. When I was 12 or 13, I would go to one of the public libraries where I lived in Sheffield. I was fascinated by large books on architecture. I had visited York Minster and Lincoln Cathedral and could see photographs of these and their notable parts and read a commentary. When I went to the Central Library, the double-decker tram took me along the Moor, Sheffield's main shopping street, where new shops were being built on land that a few years earlier were still bombed sites from World War II. Sheffield, with its steelworks, was a major target. These sites were all overgrown with rose bay willow herb. This plant looks like fire and grows where there has been fire. I was excited to see new buildings going up and quite liked the white Portland stone they were faced in. I thought they were good because they were new, they were modern. I didn't much like old Victorian buildings, which were black. When I got to the library, it was the modern architecture books that were most interesting. For instance, I saw those of the 1956 Olympic Games in Rome, a stadium by Pierluigi Nervi. I saw buildings in the USA, such as in Chicago, including by the German Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He built tall buildings faced with a grid of panels, which were shiny walls below the windows were hardly distinguishable from the windows over. This style spread across the world. But what excited me most in the library were buildings by Le Corbusier. This Swiss architect might be described as the Picasso of architecture. He designed a unité d'habitation, which was built at Marseille, not far from the Mediterranean, in 1951. It contains some 330 apartments of various sizes. The unité was built in reinforced concrete with markings of the timber boarding used as the molds strongly featured. To me, these seem to correspond to the texture of stone masonry. The building was high, something like 20 stories, but it was not a tower since it was about 3 times as long as it was high. And the elevations were like a syncopated rhythm. The arrangements of flats was clever. Each flat had windows from which the sun could be seen rising and on the other side where it could be seen setting. In other words, each flat occupied the full width of the building. They did this by being arranged in groups of 3 stories, the middle width of the middle story being an access corridor. From this, some flats usually had a bedroom opposite the entrance door and steps up or steps down to a full width flat. Each flat had a large balcony looking one way and a small one looking the other. The balconies were inset so that the floor above acted as a sunshade. After all, this was near the Mediterranean. Now I'm going to show you some pictures, all being well. Someone is going to tell me to find a button somewhere at the bottom of the screen, possibly, or they're going to provide a button for me to show, and I can then show my screen.
You click on share.
I've got share screen, yes, the bright green one. So I'll do that, and then I'll be looking for some pictures. Sorry about this. I hope you're all still there. Some buttons are covered for some reason, so a little bit. Right. So, can you all see a big building? I'll make the picture a little larger. So in the top picture, you see the Unité d'Habitation. It is about 4 stories up before you get to a living dwelling story. And if you see my my cursor, you'll see a flat here in 2 levels. I think that is. Then that's probably a 1 level flat. That's the one in 2 levels. And that's the west elevation. Down here, I think, is a supermarket. Along here are people who look south all the time. On the roof, there's a ventilator looking like a ship. And of course, it does look like an ocean liner in many ways. On the roof, there's a running track. I mean, it's very long, this. So here's a man running around. There's some pictures of the elevation. This is perhaps the entrance door. These are what Corbusier calls pilotti. They're big columns which support everything. And you can start to see the board marked concrete. And then here you can see, I think this is the shop. And then there are various flats. They're all fairly, often quite irregular. So there's quite a rhythm. Here's a concrete porch to keep you dry as you approach. There's pictures looking up the building. Now you can see the board marked concrete on the pilotti. And here is board marked concrete with various features. And here is a man called the Modulo Man. So I will now hope to return to talking mode for a time. And stopping screen share. Oh, that's good. I can see everyone. So there you are. There are a few pictures of what I'm talking about. After a year after I left school, I decided I had to actually see the Unité d'Habitation and tell my student sculptor friend Rob. He agreed. We did not have much money. In 1963, students did not. So we would hitchhike. After all, people like us in the USA hitchhiked. And we had learned how to hitchhike since Rob wanted to be in London to see art exhibitions, and I wanted to hear and see music played by the composers who would one day be venerated like Beethoven. The hitchhiking went well at first. We got all the way from Yorkshire to near Dijon, but then found ourselves on a road with too little traffic. So we counted our money and discovered we could do the rest of the outward journey by train. When we got off the train in Marseille, my French was hardly good enough to ask the way to our Cathedral of Architecture. But on hearing the architect Le Corbusier's name, everyone seemed to know why we were there, and we were put on the correct bus. This was fun. They were single deckers, but had an open air platform at the rear. So we enjoyed the fresh, hot Mediterranean air. When we got there, I was overwhelmed. The Unité was like a vast ocean liner in the midst of trees. This was 1963. The Unité was by now 10 years old. Other Unité had been built or were being built, at least 2 in France and 1 in Berlin. On the roof was a running track, exercise and play areas. Inside at various parts was a primary school and a supermarket. The different colour sidewalls inside the balconies within the grid remind of the paintings of Mondrian and give the grey stone colour a syncopation and an enhanced identity. The balconies were recessed, so there was shade from the sun. I'm now going to hope to find a picture by Mondrian. So I'm now going to screen share again. So you've probably been to art museums and seen pictures of this sort. And in many ways, they're quite architectural, being rectilinear and all these things. So I'll go back to talking for a short time, because now I've got to what I call part 2, which is subtitled Housing in Britain and Sheffield. Anyway, I've been running ahead. I had seen good photos in the books. I had wondered why Britain seemed so much behind in its design of buildings, or at least modern buildings. Now I realise this is more due to the books, and that buildings based on the new rationale exemplified by the Bauhaus in Germany, for instance, did exist. Indeed, its founder, Walter Gropius, had a spell in England, having left Germany in the early 1930s. He designed schools in East Anglia. Later, I discovered that William Morris and Charles Rennie Mackintosh had been very influential in Europe, especially in Vienna. So in 1958, Sheffield had not much changed since the 1920s, except due to German bombing. But then we, that is my father and I, heard that a vast housing development was planned to be built by the city of Sheffield on a large hillside behind the Midland train station, where poor houses had been taken down in the 1930s. A vast multi-storey estate was to be built. This was Park Hill. By 1960, sufficient scaffolding could be removed to reveal this long and vertical new city. The rhythm of the facades, which varied from 4-storey on the higher land to 14 stories on the lower parts, with a roof level constant, was influenced by Corbusier's unité, but perhaps expressed in a more English way. Brick infill within the beam and column concrete frame changed colour from a darker reddish hue low down to a lighter straw colour at the top. And there were streets in the sky serving each flat, wide enough for a milk float to drive along. These streets were every 3rd story, meaning that in 2 out of 3 stories, flats had views in opposite directions. This was the English expression of what Corbusier built beside the Mediterranean. Practically every flat had a view in opposite directions. Many of them could see the centre of Sheffield on its hill with the Pennines beyond. To the left, the valley of the River Sheaf went along towards the Peak District National Park, created less than 10 years before. Centre right was the Upper Don Valley, stretching beyond Hillsborough. So now I'm going to share screen again, and I'm getting a bit more adept at this, I hope. Now, this is a picture taken soon after Park Hill was built, so it's not early 1960s, and you can see some vehicles that look a bit of that style. There's a bit of the east end of Sheffield visible on the far left, but looking at the main building, you can see how, perhaps you can see how this street is South Street. It goes downhill, so every so often another story, as it were, emerges out of the ground. So down here, it becomes about 14 stories. Here it's about 8. And you can see how the lower ones are in a darker red brick between the reinforced concrete framework. And then the next ones up are a sort of yellowish hue in a band of 3. And then the top are in a more straw coloured or white coloured brick. And each of these bands of 3 has in its middle band a street in the sky. In fact, that is on the other side here. Now I'll put this picture down a little and look for another picture. This is a street in the sky. It's a bit ancient, this photo, but here are doors to the flats and people talking. Boy going off to school, a girl looking over towards the vast sort of parkland, which is within the flats. I'm sorry, I've gone out of screen share. I'll go back into it. There's another old picture here. This is a bit tricky to see, but there's a milk float coming on and a toddler. I don't know why it's so small. And this is an aerial view, rather more recent, probably within the last 10 or 15 years. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but to the lower left, it's just 4 stories. And then this street goes downhill. Here's the this is the railway station on the left. The big white building is a big swimming pool. Towards the top of the picture, Park Hill is much taller because the ground is lower down. And it comes in various stretches with angles between.
Jeffrey, sorry to interrupt. Please, could you make the picture a bit bigger?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Sorry, there we are. I'm very sorry. Thank you, Sophie. Yes, so I'll say it again. Here, this building is just 4 stories. This is Talbot Street here. This is South Street here. This is a train station. This is bits of the Hallam University. There's a site here that's not yet been built on by Hallam University. They build everywhere now. Here's a roundabout that goes off, the road goes off to the motorway. So back in Park Hill, here the ground is a lot lower, so the stories are about 14 in number. So I'll adjourn screen sharing and return to my text. Got to part 3 now, how it affected me. Well, Park Hill was key to my future direction. I became a structural engineer as I liked concrete buildings. One of my first jobs was in an engineering section of an architect's practice in Sheffield. Later, I got a job at the National Building Agency in London, working alongside architects and the other construction professionals. Later, I set up my own structural consultancy, employing several staff in East London and continued in that for 30 years. I was never far away from architects, and though I started with the modern multi-storey buildings, Georgian houses came to fascinate. In the latter part of my professional life, it was often the Victorian house that had developed cracking that I was advising on. All my practice was helping to extend one under the design of an architect because the family needed an extra bedroom for the adolescent. For 17 years, I lived in a Quaker community, which I had helped found in a large building with rooms over the shop in Bethnal Green, East London. Then, when Heather's father left us money, we bought a derelict house in East London and refurbished it. We did not have children and were pleased to have 2 lodgers who joined in our shared life. That was until Heather died 17 years later. Only in the last 10 years or so have I lived with just one other person, Hilary, therefore in more conventional housing. But all aspects of housing, especially the safe enjoyment for residents, has been the story of my life. Some months ago, with Britain in pandemic, Hilary and I thought a way to keep variety in our lives without, for instance, holidays on the continent. We thought we might take a small flat in another part of England. As I was brought up in Sheffield, we looked around there. Nothing much suited. From many parts of the centre, Park Hill is visible, and I couldn't help noticing it. We made inquiries. Yes, a one-bedroom flat could be rented. So yes, we took it for a proportion of my time, and for a proportion of my time, I now live there. A conservation developer called Urban Splash had taken over Park Hill and is refurbishing it in Frasers. Through over 30 years of Thatcherist housing policy, Park Hill had deteriorated at the hands of local politicians who seemed to me to have been poorly versed in civic matters. Indeed, they wanted to demolish it, but they couldn't, as it was listed. In fact, it is the biggest listed building in Europe. That aside, I just love being in a place with concrete walls laid out on a hillside to complement the city centre opposite, and from where the horizon is the Pennines. Indeed, government housing policy is another thing. At least in the 1950s, when Harold Macmillan was Minister of Housing, well over 500,000 new homes were being built a year in Britain, roughly half by the private sector and half by local authorities. This is around twice what has been built in the UK in recent years, largely because Westminster is against local authorities, it seems to me. I know many people who would like different models, both in forms of tenure and in forms of building. And now we are, or should be, looking towards net zero carbon. How to get there with the nation's housing stock is not today's topic, but you could hear more about my views here by pressing a button with my name on in the area meeting July newsletter. Thank you for listening to my ramble. If there are questions, I'll try and answer, and I might have a few other visuals available. I could show you a very famous building by Le Corbusier towards the end, a different one. Ray?
What is the
Okay.
prospect do you see, Jeffrey, for concrete buildings in the future?
Well, if you might ask, what's the prospect for concrete in the future? Because making concrete uses cement plus stone, which the builder calls aggregate. Cement requires a vast amount of energy to make it. It's made in kilns at very high temperatures. So it gobbles up energy, and so it's a bad thing in many ways. Now, there are indeed people looking at other forms of concrete and even taking patents out of other forms of concrete. And I saw something about a woman in the USA who's got a patent on something which is almost like biological concrete. And she's got a small company going, but I've lost track of this. But the answer is that we probably have to use cement in the future quite a bit still. And another answer might be that we try and keep any structure that's made of concrete. And if we need to use it in a different way, we'll try to adapt it. And there are plenty of interesting architects around. And in fact, just a few months ago, the biggest architecture prize, which is, I think it's French, it's something like the Schwitzer Prize, was won by an architect in Paris who converted a building, who totally altered a multi-story building, added balconies, things to it, and made it green. And it looks exciting and it looks good to live in. So this is where you need architects who are geniuses. We don't have too many geniuses. second best is that they're influenced by geniuses, and if they do it well, we can get some jolly good buildings. Ray, that's a bit about concrete. Of course, concrete is difficult to avoid when it comes to foundations nowadays. So you still have to have something of that sort, because that is what led to multi-story buildings being possible. The fact that concrete was reinforced by steel bars could be used in the foundations.
Because the corollary of that, if I may be so bold, is the fact that a lot of stuff which was built in the 60s, was kind of, as a friend of mine would say, was thrown up and is now being knocked down because the concrete is crumbling.
Well, one of my specialities was what you might call crumbling concrete. It was poor quality workmanship. If it was well built, it wouldn't be crumbling. When I was 40 or 50 years ago, people thought reinforced concrete would last forever. But about 30 years ago, they realized that the cement or the matrix of this concrete, which is highly alkaline, it was discovered that it loses some of its alkalinity as atmospheric carbon dioxide permeates into the concrete. So it's now recognized that the alkalinity reduces within about 15 millimeters of the outside surface. So it's good practice that all the steel reinforcing bars have what we call more than 15 millimeters cover. And a lot of concrete that is in poor condition is because the building work wasn't very well supervised, and the cage of reinforcement was out of position or something. It was too near one side. So that is one of the problems with concrete that was poured in situ by the builder on site from a truck. Of course, a lot of concrete was precast, and builders have always hoped to build their building in a factory and move them to the site and put them down, and that's it. There was a lot of concrete slab building in the 1960s. And indeed, the National Building Agency, which I joined about 1975, had been going for 10 years then. It was founded initially to assess how concrete slab buildings could successfully comply with the building regulations. The building regulations thought a building would have brick walls, and these ones didn't have brick walls. So there were many tricky things, and they got a lot of clever people to work out how to do this. And by and large, concrete panel buildings can work very well. And indeed, there are some commercial ones within a mile of here on Temple Way that envelop, is it Sir Thomas Lawrence's house, who was the famous painter? That is a precast concrete panel system used commercially, and it looks like it's surviving. There might be other things that are problematic about it, but it's a non-residential building that's probably 40 years old. Any more questions about concrete? I could go on forever if you like. Now, who's chairing this? Because I saw 3 hands. I think Ray's the chair. So Ray will choose a hand.
Oh, you're not a speaker, you. Sophie.
Jeffrey, just a really quick question. Well, firstly, sorry that I was a bit late joining, and so this may have been covered in the first few minutes, but can you just remind me, the Park Hill development, I know it was inspired by Le Corbusier, but was it designed by him or by somebody else?
No, it was not designed by him. It was designed by the City Architects Department, the boss of which was Mr. Womersley, but the 2 job architects were Ivor Smith and Jack Lynn. So it was an in-house design in the town hall in Sheffield. In those days, the architects department might have been 100 people, because everybody had to draw things and people had to trace things and to prepare extra drawings, all kinds of things. It's labour intensive. I knew people in the city engineers department. That was about 200 people, I think. But of course, everything's changed since then, and those departments don't exist. I went to a conference about 15 years ago, and next to me, I asked this man what he did, and he said, "I'm the city architect of Sheffield." So I said, "Goodness me, you must have 300 staff." And he said, "No, I've got 3. Ever since Mrs. Thatcher through the upset the apple cart, as I might say, they go to an outside consultant. And of course, they don't want to build public sector housing, and they don't want local authorities to be autonomous. So there are lots of reasons why there's no longer an architects department in Sheffield, or in most, practically any other local authority, really. So I don't know if that answers you, Sophie. They were very influenced by Le Corbusier. Perhaps they went to the library and looked at the same books as I did, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's really interesting.
Raise the man spotting hand.
David.
Yeah, 2 questions in slightly different directions since we're veering off concrete. And the first is about Bristol, which is that there's been some debate. We have a mayor who favours high-rise buildings and a civic society who don't. And I believe in the recent election, part of the reason that Windmill Hill went green was because they didn't want high rises where the mayor wanted to put them. So I wonder what your, and George Ferguson was a fan of the sort of German style of architecture where you had mid-sized buildings like 5 or 6 stories with space around them, like in Freiburg. So I wonder what your feeling is about big and small. And the other one is, that some quite large buildings these days are starting to be built using timber, which means that you can put a lightweight building that's still quite sizable. And I wonder what your feeling is, whether that's more natural and appropriate or what. So.
Okay, well, regarding building and high rises, I do happen to be a member of the Civic Society, and I was invited to be a member of their major sites group. So we get privileged access to new proposed developments, even before the formal application is put in and before it becomes public, once it's got to the planning department and they post it on the internet. And yes, it's true that many people think tall buildings are out of place in Bristol. And by and large, I think they're right, and I agree with them. But I don't always agree with them, and I'm sometimes, they said they didn't want a 10-story building off the back of the pavement. And I gave an example in Hamburg of a very famous building in all the architecture books. It's brick and it's 10 stories high, and it looks exciting to me. Anyway, they didn't agree with me especially, so they gave a view that it was a bad idea. And mostly they do, but now and then they listen to me. But by and large, currently there is a research project by Reading University, which Civic Society has been invited to join in. And this is nominate a building that you think should not have been built. And then these specialists in the planning department in Reading University are going to look into all the paperwork that allowed it to be built. So I think the Civic Society is nominating, I think it's called Castle View, which is the new residential block just completing at the east end of Castle Park. I suggested that, and another chap, Matthew, agreed with it. Matthew and I don't usually agree at all, because he thinks for instance, the conservative planning ideas are wonderful, and I don't. So I'm a bit on the left wing and he's a bit on the right wing, but we tend to agree that tower blocks anywhere is not a good idea in Bristol. Marvin Rees, the mayor, seems to think they're okay. My personal view is that tower blocks, tall buildings are okay in selected locations. For example, I would suggest, for example, travel nodes like near a railway station or other natural node points. and then there could be a cluster of a few tall buildings, but that's my personal view. The mayor doesn't go with that. There are a lot of sites, especially in places in Bedminster, where over the last 30 years, people have bought sites and then they've sold them to someone else. And eventually there's a patchwork of Bedminster, which is owned by about 3 property companies, and they're putting in applications for buildings, or usually residential. So, you know, good thing in a way. Of course, they have a very small, affordable element, which is in them. Anyway, the mayor is all for tall buildings and thinks that will solve the housing problem. Most of the people think it will spoil Bristol irredeemably. So coming on to timber buildings, I've worked quite a bit with timber frame housing. So, and there's a lot of timber frame housing, and you won't know that because it's clad in brickwork. So the timber frames are made in a factory and come to site on trucks, and chaps with hammers and things, well, they build a foundations arrangement and slabs and things. Then these panels are built, and then they put floor joists in, and then they lift the next story in, and they can go up to about 4 or 5 stories in timber. And then in many cases, they will clad them in brickwork. Now that's good because at least it's good for the brick industry. They like it because there might be timber buildings, but at least they've got a lot of bricks in them. Bricks are okay in some places, I feel, but there are other forms of cladding. But whether you can produce a very pleasing looking building with other forms of cladding is slightly more debatable. So that's up to possibly up to at least 4 stories. Of course, once they're built, they should be fairly safe in terms of fire, even though they're full of timber. But there's 2 caveats to that. The first one is before they're finished, they're an absolute nightmare because they're like a timber yard with all the timbers nicely spaced. And 10 or 15 years ago, there were several fires on building sites where all the timber framing was up, and somehow it caught light and it all burnt down. So it's the biggest bonfire you could hope to see that. Sorry to be so flippant about fires, especially as there was a very notable fire in Bristol just 2 years ago at the Premier Inn Hotel on Cribbs Causeway, and that caught fire. Now, I think that had got brick cladding, but it proved to be a timber frame building. And once it had caught, the fire brigade just had to stand there and make sure it didn't do too much harm to the neighbouring buildings whilst it burnt down. So what the insurance company thinks about this, they're probably putting up their premiums now for timber frame buildings. And it's always interesting to know what the insurance world thinks about what's happening. So, so David, your answer on timber frame, that is a timber frame building. Of course, there always have been timber frame buildings. It's just that in the later part of the 20th century, companies started making all the panels in a factory and transporting them to site. Bigger other sorts of buildings in timber, I don't know. Well, there's a very interesting one in Sheffield. It's called the Winter Gardens, but it's not it's really just many series, a lot of parabolic arches made out of glue lamb, which is timber skillfully glued together and to shapes even. And these parabolic arches are now glazed over, and they grow plants in them and palm trees and exotic trees. So that's an example of a timber building. But there'll no doubt be other people looking into timber buildings for other things. The builders like them because they can be put up quite quickly, and the bricklayers can work on the outside, and the electrician can work at the same time on the inside, sort of thing, and the plumber too. So And indeed, a hotel that I think is timber frame is very close to here. It's on Newfoundland Way, called the Moxie Hotel, or at least that's what it might be called when it's finished. It seems to have gone very slow in the last 6 months. I don't know why. They lifted it all into position quickly, and now it seems to have got stuck. Possibly it's caught coronavirus or something. I don't know. Anyway, David, there we are. Any, I could. I saw Pat's, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question related to the substance. I lived for a while in Barton House, in Barton Hill, and we suffered very much from damp and mold. It was, as far as I knew, it was a concrete building. I mean, I don't know. Could you? I mean, is this a problem with concrete, which is now overcome? Is this simply a thing? Because I'm going back 40 years here.
Well, although I was a structural engineer at the National Building Agency, and although that was closed by the government in the early 1980s, I worked with an offshoot consultancy for another 20 years. And I often heard the architects and the building surveyors besieged by problems to do with condensation in flats. Now, you've got to bear in mind that in 1960, coal was very cheap, and all they did then was think of different ways of heating buildings. And in fact, the original Park Hill was called district heating. There was a boiler and a big building at one end and a big chimney, and they heated all the hot water and sent it around all the flats. And in fact, the flat I'm in now is a modern version of that. But coming back to condensation, once coal prices, well, of course, we had Clean Air Acts and coal was bad news. So other forms of heating were thought of. And quite often these were these were relatively expensive then. And a lot of poor people couldn't afford it couldn't afford to heat the places. So some of them noticed that there was a hardware shop down the road that was selling paraffin heaters and things like that. So quite often people would declare unilateral independence when it comes to their heating, and they bought a sort of paraffin stove or something. And of course they put out moisture, and that adds to the condensation risk on the cold surfaces in the house. Quite often people didn't or wouldn't or couldn't ventilate their rooms quite well enough. So that meant condensation could increase again. Condensation happens if the dew point is, if the surface temperature is such that with the humidity, dampness settles on a surface. And of course, after that, mold can build up. So it's been quite a big issue, and it still happens. And you see news reports of people with private landlords, and they don't know how to handle it really, and possibly because in many ways, one answer is to clad the outside of the building with thermal render, or and keep the cold right outside. But it's quite a tricky thing how to start altering buildings and making them warmer and use less energy. And we've just been looking at net zero carbon in our area meeting, and that's another story. So there we are there. I guess condensation and mold might be with us always. Let's just hope it's minimized.
Anybody else? Graham.
I just wondered how the Unity building in Marseille, Le Corbusier, has lasted over the years. How much maintenance does it need, and are the residents of the flats happy with their surroundings?
Well, I'm not the best person to answer that one, of course, but I would just say that I did see the Unité perhaps 15 years ago, and just seeing it is only half the story. I'm pretty sure that the concrete has got enough cover to the steel, so I don't think there's something that's crudely called concrete cancer happening. I think the framework is every likelihood it's going to last for hundreds of years. I did go to a unité in Nantes about 20 years ago, and there was a publicly open exhibition which was in one of the flats, and this was staffed by local residents who lived in the unité. And there was a lady there who'd been there since she was a girl. That was built about 1960, I think. She'd been there since she was a girl, and they all, this particular flat had got original furniture, which tended to be like shaped plywood on metal frames. So that was extremely interesting to see authentic Le Corbusier furniture that was low cost, but very effective. Longer term issues like heating, well, I don't know quite. In the south of France, there's a different ball game, as it were. Once you're into northern France, it is a different thing. My impression is that reinforced concrete does transmit or does allow heat out of the building, but if it's well made, it doesn't do it to a high degree. But concrete panel buildings are a different thing entirely. And of course, they started cladding those. I remember seeing one of the first clad buildings on Maida Vale in London about 20 years ago, and it had been done in quite an imaginative way, and it looked quite jazzy in its way. And so one thought, well, you know, at least they are finding ways of making tower blocks, keeping the residents warm and reducing their heating bills. But you only have to mention Grenfell Tower to know that it could go badly wrong. And I've got strong views about that, but now's not the time to say those.
And any other questions, friends? Hilary?
Well, I've got a few comments really, which might be of interest to people. When I first met Jeffrey, he was living, as he mentions, in a sort of commune with a younger man and an older woman, and it looked a little unusual. However, I don't take face value to much nowadays. And it was clear that investigating this, it was quite an innocent setup. And although he didn't have a bedroom, which was a little unusual, and he would get out this bed every night and make up this bed because the guest bedroom was far more important. I quickly got used to this rather unusual setup. Anyway, this lateral thinking came in useful to us both, I think, this in the last year, when we thought that it was not a good idea to go to Europe. And so we thought we would stay in the UK. And although we had initial ideas of a minimal place in London, this quickly changed to Sheffield. And you have now heard the reasons why. So I think that rather surprisingly, my main problems in lockdown have been not going on trains and Jeffrey on Zoom meetings. So both of those problems are solved with Sheffield. And I have to say that last Monday, I walked down from our rented flat with Jeffrey to the train station, which is main Sheffield station, very close. And at considerable expense, I came very quickly to Bristol. So at 5:30, I left our flat. I caught the train just before 6, and I arrived back in Bristol to be looking at some rather gentle and not very, well, there was quite interesting television at 9:30 in Bristol. So actually, the logistics of this, although very surprising to me to begin with, actually aren't quite as mad as they may seem initially.
Right.
But as you've gathered, I'm very committed to Bristol.
May I ask you, another question, because we have a little bit more time.
You're looking at me, I think.
I'm looking at you. Are there any modern day architects which excite you the way they did in the past?
Well, there are more. Over the years, the answer is yes, certainly. I used to, when I was in London, I went around London a lot because my work took me around London a lot, and I probably knew London better than the average cab driver. And so I was very pleased to now and then be in a certain quarter and see a building going up. Let's mention the name Richard Rogers. He must be about 90 by now, so I don't think he's working any longer. But he did some very fine buildings in London. He did the Lloyd's building, where all the insides are on the outside, as it were. And of course, he'd done the Pompidou Centre in Paris itself, which was, or with Renzo Piano. Those two architects won this competition, and they built a building, and it was, the idea was to make sure that to design it so that there were no columns or anything interfering with the floors. So Richard Rogers scratched his head, and he went to an architect called Ted Happold. And Ted Happold had a practice. Well, he was working for Arup then. Ted Happold formed his own practice, and it's based in Bath, and it's called Bureau Happold. And Ted Happold sadly died at the age of 60 from a heart condition. But Ted Happold was a Quaker. And Richard Rogers, when there was an exhibition of his work at the Royal Academy 4 or 5 years ago, there's a little text in it saying where he's reporting it. And he said, it's all Ted's idea, really. So the Pompidou Centre in Paris was our friend Ted Happold's idea, and Richard Rogers just made it work, you see. So there's an architect who's no longer creating. Norman Foster was very big. He was a Manchester man. He was very commercial. He did work all over the world. He designed the biggest airport you could think of for the Chinese somewhere, and he also adapted the Reichstag in Berlin, which is now the German Parliament. And a friend of mine is a German MP, and he took me round that about 15 years ago. And so that was a Manchester architect, Norman Foster. He's also up at 80s. Ones who are practicing and who are alive now. I'm just having to think. It's a bit like composers who are alive now that are like, and I'm starting to not keep up with the world now. You see, I'm
Jeffrey.
Hello.
Any women?
Yes, definitely. Certainly. Sadly, she died about 3 years ago. Did lots of big buildings all around the world from her London office. Her name is, oh goodness.
It's the lady who liked potatoes.
Yes.
Wasn't she Iranian or something?
That's right, yes.
Trained in London. Yeah, she was.
Something Hadid.
That's it. Zaha Hadid. Well done, Ray. You win that one. Zaha Hadid, yes, she did very organic shaped buildings, not a straight line in them. And of course, the irony is I don't know that she's built very much in Britain, because authorities in Britain aren't very adventurous. So that she may have been based in London, but did things all over the world. She was she died of quite suddenly in a New York hotel about 3 years ago. Zaha Hadid is very good. I mean, I worked with various architects, but they didn't hit the headlines in that way.
Could I ask who somebody, David, something beginning with M, did the extension for the V&A or the Science Museum or something along there?
Is he the Ghanaian architect? David, oh dear, Adije, is it? He's very interesting. He's a man from Ghana, and he started 30 years ago, but he recently designed in Washington, D.C., the Museum of Black Culture or something like that, which is a big place to go to in Washington, D.C. So he's based in London, but very international now. My memory doesn't, my lips don't quite get the correct surname, but Zaha Hadid, Ray was right there, yes. And she's sadly missed.
What about the museum in, I was going to say Barcelona, but that's her, Bilbao.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, that's the American architect. And I've seen work of his. I went to see that. Oh, dear me, I should have had a thesaurus of architects' names in front of me. And I'm sort of forgetting them all. But he's probably fairly senior now. And it's a big museum in Bilbao, isn't it? On the north coast of Spain. And I did go to see that, but behind it, I saw lots of rectilinear steelwork. So I thought, how boring. He got a boring engineer, whereas Zaha Hadid would go to Arup or Hapoels and get an engineer who can design curve structure. So, and that's far more organic. And if you've got an organic shape for your building, you need organic shape for your structure. Of course, in the old days, people just had rulers and pencils, so everything was straight and either horizontal or vertical. But since computers arrived, they can do any shape, and they can even make a machine to make the shaped part, and even put it on the lorry at the correct time of day to arrive at the correct time on the building site for the crane to be ready to lift it straight into position. So these things can happen nowadays, thanks to computers.
Any of the Japanese architects appeal to you?
Well, now, again, I'm showing my inability to remember names, but I did go to the new V&A Museum in Dundee on the coast beside the River Tay, where they've got a sort of Scottish branch of the Victoria and Albert Museum now. And this architect is sometimes quoted as one of the top 5 architects in the world. But again, my recollection goes of his name. It was a very interesting building, really, because although it's all modern, and in the old days, I liked anything that was modern, I'm not so sure about it, because I felt there was no human scale visible. The entrance, I think there are lots of horizontal surfaces. And the architect said he was influenced by the rocky coast of Scotland. So he made lots of surfaces that undulated and looked like a cliff face. And then the entrance was more like a cave in the cliff face. But that's not really human scale. And I do kind of think human scale is important on buildings. And I forgot to show you something, and I'd like to just go to share screen and show you something that's human scale that Le Corbusier used. It's called Le Modular. And this is a man, and it's all to do with the golden proportion, the golden mean. So here we are. I'll just try and get this on screen. Now I hope you can see this chap who's 6 foot tall, or 1829 millimeters, and he's got his hands up high, and somewhere around his solar plexus is the golden mean.
We can't see anything, Jeffrey.
You can't. Oh, that's difficult. That's right. Let me just escape from this. I'll just try and do share screen again, and maybe that'll do it now.
Yep, there you go.
So he called this modular. So and he did all these dimensions, and so the big one is the golden mean. Is people may have heard of golden mean. It's where, well, I'll show you the Wikipedia definition of golden mean. It'll make it easier for me if I can find that. Okay, well, oh, here it is, sorry.
Golden ratio, yeah.
So it's two quantities are in the golden ratio if their ratio is the same as the ratio of the sum to the larger of the two quantities. So, so there's a picture here which has gone off screen, but it's ever since times of the Greeks, it's been thought of as a good thing. So in the 20th century, Le Corbusier looked at this and he devised a whole suite of proportions, and he, for example, he makes his seat heights to be on the modular, and he makes his table heights to be on the modular, and they all work very comfortably. You could sit on a concrete seat and it's very comfortable because it's just the right height. If you're 1829 millimeters tall, that is, which is 6'1". Anyway, so I forgot to mention how Le Corbusier was very conscious of the human frame and how buildings should relate to the human need. Of course, he blotted his copybooks, certainly for people in England, because he's around about 1960, he said, the house is a machine for living in.
Yeah.
So, and no honest British person wants to live in a machine. So this didn't do his cause very good in Britain. And indeed, no building of his was ever built in Britain. However, the Americans were not put off by this. There's a department at Harvard University, which is designed by him around about 1960. I've seen pictures of it, but not been to it. Ray, it's over to you now. I mean, I might be spilling over a bit now.
I'll just tell you the Japanese architect for the V&A is Kengo Kuma.
Ah, yes. Nearly on the tip of my tongue, that was. There's a well-known one, Japanese architectural Kenzo Tame, is it? Kenzo Tange, I think. And if you look at the Olympics, you'll see some interesting architecture because usually they get an inventive architect to design a stadium, because it's a bit unfortunate if it's a damp squib at a stadium. We'll not talk about how many people are in it at the moment, but or not in it. There we are. Thank you, Hattie, for that prompt. You can probably tell me some of the other names if we stop a little longer. So you're muted.
I just said look them up.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's where I need a picture book. It's much easier with a picture book.
Okay, then, friends. I think that we have come to a natural end here. And thank you, Jeffrey, for a very interesting and illuminating talk. And this is the last talk we have now, friends, until September, when we hope and trust we will see you all and tell your friends and all that lot for September the 3rd. We're not quite sure what we're going to get yet, but we will get back to you on it. So, as David Frost would say, thank you and good night.